Now turn to Part 2, questions 8 to 13. You will hear a man called Frank talking on the radio about looking for ships that sank at sea long ago. For each question, put a tick in the correct box. You now have 45 seconds to look at the questions for Part 2. Now we are ready to start. Listen carefully. You will hear the recording twice.
Frank, tell us about some of the ships you've discovered.
Well, there's nothing quite like finding your first old ship. It was 300 years old. It was just lying at the bottom of the sea, so it wasn't difficult to find. Most are covered in sand and rocks, but this one wasn't. I'm actually a teacher, not a full-time diver. I dive in my free time, but I often get to them before the professional divers because I have good, up-to-date equipment. Another thing that helps is talking to fishermen who tell me about their local area. I've even written a book about some of their experiences. At the moment, I'm looking for the gold from a ship called the Seabird. It was an enormous, well-built ship, and it was coming from Australia on a winter night in 1859. Everything was going fine until the ship reached the English coast, when it crashed into some rocks in a very strong wind and sank to the bottom of the sea. It was carrying gold from Australia, and most of it is still at the bottom of the sea. My wedding ring is actually made from gold, which I found on an 18th century sailing ship. A friend of mine, another diver, has already found £88,000 worth of gold from different ships. He's now decided to give up his job and become a full-time diver. My house is full of things like coins, bottles, and old guns. My wife is always complaining about the number of objects around the house. She says I should open an antiques shop. But I love all these old things. Anyway, in the end, I gave some things from my collection to museums because I didn't want to sell them. But my wife still wasn't very pleased, I'm afraid. As diving is a dangerous hobby, it's not a good idea to try to teach yourself. I'd advise anyone interested to do what I did. There are some excellent diving clubs, like the one I joined, which run courses for beginners. It's best to do one of these before you go on a diving holiday.
Today's guest needs no introduction. He is a man who's given us hours of interest and entertainment over the years with his weekly series of wildlife programmes. He is, of course, Martin Middleton. Martin, you've been to the four corners of the earth in search of material. Where did this love of adventures come from?
I don't really know. I didn't travel much as a child, but I remember reading about the East and being fascinated by it. Then, when I was about 12, I met someone who'd been to Singapore, and to me that seemed incredible. And, of course, when I started in television back in the early 1960s, you didn't travel to make a wildlife program. You went along and filmed at the local zoo. So when I said I'd like to go and film in Africa, the head of programs just laughed at me.
And did you go to Africa?
On that occasion, no. But I eventually got them to allow me to go to Borneo in 1962. There was just me and a cameraman. We went off for 4 months, filming wherever we found something interesting. We bought a canoe, sailed upriver for 10 days, and ended up in a traditional longhouse. Nowadays, of course, it's all quite different.
Different in what way?
We do months of preparation before we set off, so when we start filming, we know exactly what scenes we want to get. I mean, you don't get up in the morning and say to your team, "What shall we do this morning?" You have to know exactly what each scene is going to show, to work to a strict plan.
Some of your programmes have taken place in some pretty remote areas. It's hard to imagine other programme makers wanting to risk the dangers or discomfort that you've experienced.
Well, if you want original material, you've got to go off the beaten track. But you can find yourself doing some pretty strange things. Like, for example, on one occasion, jumping out of a helicopter onto an iceberg. There I was, freezing cold. Then it started to snow, and the helicopter had gone back to the ship and couldn't take off again. So I was stuck there on his iceberg thinking, this is crazy. I didn't even want to come here.
What I wonder is, where does somebody like yourself, who travels to all these exotic places as part of their work, go on holiday?
I'm not very good at lying on a beach, that's for sure. I wouldn't go to a place just to sit around. It's nice to have an objective when you're travelling, to have something you want to film. I've just come back from the Dominican Republic, and we were put up for the first night in a big hotel. The place was absolutely full of people, just lying there sunbathing. They seemed quite happy to spend the whole day stretched out around the pool. They never seemed to want to go and explore the amazing things there were to see outside the hotel. For me, that would be a very boring way to spend a holiday.
Oh, your programmes, though, must have inspired a lot of people to take their holidays in remote and little-known places.
You are probably right. But, well, I have mixed feelings about all this. I go back to the places where, years ago, I was the only European. And now there are cruise ships coming 3 times a day. So you worry that in 10 years or so, every remote place on the planet will be swallowed up, because everyone will be visiting it. But, on the other hand, I am in favour of tourism that is done in a way that protects the environment. You can see a good example of this in the Galapagos Islands, where the tourism is carefully managed. That's very successful and could be a model for the future.
You will hear Sarah Brown talking about her work as a television weather forecaster. Hello, I'm Sarah Brown, and I'm here to tell you about my job as a weather forecaster. I've been a weather forecaster for a television company for 7 years, and 2 years ago I became the head of the weather department. Now I divide my time equally between presenting weather forecasting on television and managing the weather department, which has a staff of 11. At 30 years old, I'm the youngest ever head of weather, and the first woman to do the job. Since our news and weather service goes out all round the world, we all take turns to work at night. I prefer that to doing the show when I have to get up at 4 in the morning. I normally work an 8-hour day, and in that time I do 10 or 12 forecasts. Before doing a weather forecast, I study data on the computer. This is the information I use in my forecasts. There isn't much time to learn what I have to say, but fortunately I've never forgotten my words, so I don't get nervous. My husband and I try to have the same free days, but neither of us has a regular pattern of work. He's a pilot on long-distance flights, so although he works hard, he has a lot more time at home than I do. We moved to our present house about a year ago, and he's enjoying painting it. I took up flying as a hobby 5 years ago. I hope to get my pilot's licence this year, but because of the job, I haven't been to the flying school for ages. For exercise, I swim and ski, and I like running. I'm really proud of myself for running in the London Marathon. It's a 40-kilometre race, and I never thought I could manage it. My husband plays tennis, and we sometimes play together, but he's better than me, so I never win. Because I'm on world news, people sometimes recognise me in really distant places. Once, in an Indian village, an old man took me to have my photo taken with all his family. I get some lovely letters. One person wrote to say that my smile made her feel happy all day. People occasionally even write and ask me to marry them.
The Youth Hostel Association started in the 1930s, and since then the organisation has continued to provide low-cost accommodation for millions of people travelling around. I asked Colin Brown, a representative of the YHA, for an update on the hostel situation. Colin, first of all, is it true that the hostels aren't as good as they used to be?
Well, if you're asking me about quality, I'd say, and most would agree with me, that the opposite is the case. The original hostels were pretty tough places to stay in. No hot water, hard floors and beds.
But People argue that hostel travellers don't want fluffy carpets and matching curtains, and that this goes against the original aims of the organisation.
Well, all I can say is that these criticisms have no basis in fact. We know what we're doing. We do market research, we talk to a random selection of people who regularly stay in hostels, and the results show that we're getting it right.
But if you look back to the 30s and 40s, when the organisation started, the general philosophy was very different, wasn't it?
I think the important thing to remember is that we aren't in the 1940s anymore. Teenagers don't travel around on their own as much as they did then, because parents no longer consider it safe. Our hostels are still full, but things have changed. Visitors now are often young families with children, couples on restricted budgets, people who care about the environment and are pretty green.
How has this affected hostel rules and regulations?
Well, we have to market the YHA to be competitive in the 21st century. Rules have become more flexible to accommodate the different types of hostel and their visitors. Sometimes there's no rule about what time you have to be back at night, for example, but not in all hostels. And we still have large, open-plan dormitories, which not everyone wants.
So you've switched really from just offering basic self-service style accommodation to being more of a service organisation, like a hotel.
Yes, and it's a reflection of what people want. You should see my postbag. For every member who writes to say, it's not like it used to be, we get a pile of letters saying, this is great. If we'd stuck to the old ways, there wouldn't be a YHA. There'd be a few hostels with a small membership of ageing hostelers with no newcomers and no future.
Colin, can we talk a little about rural hostels? I know you've had to close some of these. How do you decide when to close a hostel?
There are any number of reasons for closing a hostel. Leases run out, buildings become uneconomic, visiting patterns change. The general policy is to consider closing hostels which are significantly below standard, particularly in terms of safety, where the remedial work required would be very expensive.
It seems odd to be closing them down when I know a lot of companies in this type of business are doing just the opposite.
It's true. I do get lots of inquiries, more every year, from people who want to set up a hostel or a chain of hostels. And I suppose I do wonder sometimes if we might end up with more hostels than the market can cope with. Take the island of Skye in Scotland, for example. 10 years ago, there were 20 hostels there. Now there are over 500.
Now turn to part 2, questions 8 to 13. You will hear an Englishwoman called Britta talking to an interviewer about her life in Berlin, the capital of Germany. For each question, put a tick in the correct box. You now have 45 seconds to look at the questions for part 2. Now we are ready to start. Listen carefully. You will hear the recording twice.
Britta, you're English, but you live in Berlin. Have you lived here for a long time?
Well, I was born in England, but I've lived in Germany for the past 20 years. I arrived in Berlin about 4 years ago. Before that, I lived in Bonn for 6 years. But I work as a journalist, and when the newspaper moved to Berlin, I moved with them.
Were you pleased to come to Berlin?
Yes, I was. I was looking forward to being in a big city like Berlin. Bonn was quite a lot smaller, so I love the busy atmosphere and all the cultural entertainments here, museums, theatres and so on. The only thing I don't like is the traffic. It's a bit noisy in the mornings. It wakes me up about 6:30, but most days I have to get up early anyway.
Where do you live in Berlin?
I have a flat in the old part of the city. It's right in the centre, and it's not too expensive. It costs me about £500 a month. My street is becoming very popular. There are lots of new art galleries and small cafes and friendly restaurants everywhere. Eating out in Berlin is fun and it's cheap, so it's something I do quite often.
How do you find transport in Berlin?
Well, the transport system here is very good. So I have a tram and bus ticket. But in fact, most of the time I cycle. Travel here is much cheaper than in other countries I know. Perhaps that's why people don't walk very much.
What do you like to do in Berlin at the weekends?
Well, I like art, so sometimes I go to one of the galleries. I have a nephew called Philippe. He's only 3, but he likes coming with me. He likes the cafe best, I think. And it's a change from going to the park. That's something he does very often. He usually comes out with me while his parents go shopping.
Do you miss your friends and family in England?
I don't really miss England. Most of my friends are here. I don't see much of my work colleagues socially, but I've got some very good friends who live in the same street as me. I enjoy meeting people, and I find Berlin is a very friendly city.
Thank you for talking to us, Britta.
This is the listening test. There are 2 parts in the listening section. You will hear each part twice. After each part, you will have a 10-second pause to do. Part 1, from question 1 to 6. You will hear a radio interview with a ballet dancer called Elena Karpov, who is talking about her life and career. Choose the correct answer A, B or C to answer each of the following questions.
My guest today is the star of the London Ballet Company, 22-year-old Elena Karpov. Elena, you were born in Bulgaria. Did you always want to be a dancer?
Well, I was a very lively little girl, so at the age of 7, my mother sent me to gymnastics classes. When I was 9, I went on to ballet lessons, and from that moment I knew that I wanted to spend my life dancing. 2 years later, when I was 11, I won a place at the New York Ballet School.
So you had to move to the United States. Did you miss your family?
Oh, yes. At first it was difficult being away from home and not knowing a lot of English, but it taught me how to look after myself and not to depend on others. There were other Bulgarian students there, and we actually found it quite easy to learn enough English to take part in the lessons with the other students.
Tell us about your latest role with the London Ballet Company.
I'm going to dance the part of Cinderella. It's a story about a poor girl who marries a handsome prince. My parents used to read it to me when I was little. I'd never seen the ballet before, but I already knew the music really well. I'm sure children will love the ballet.
What do you do when you're not practicing or performing?
Before I joined this company, I spent 2 weeks going round London as a tourist. I don't have time for sightseeing now, but I love trying on the latest fashions with my friends. I'm always buying new jeans and trainers. I'm not too keen on discos and nightclubs. I dance enough during the day.
You must have lots of fans.
Quite a few. They always ask for a photograph of me, but unfortunately I don't have many to give away. I sometimes sign their programmes instead, and if I can, I give them one of the flowers I've received from the audience. They always ask for tickets, but of course that's not possible.
What's been the best thing that's happened in your career so far?
Well, I've been a guest dancer with ballet companies in Moscow and Vienna, and I appeared twice on television in Bulgaria and met the president. I shall never forget that. But the most satisfying thing for me is that I'm paid for doing what I really enjoy, dancing.
Elena, thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.